Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the moment that changes the divine masculine is not love itself, but the kind of intimacy he cannot control? What if it is not the kiss, the chemistry, or the emotional high that transforms him, but the shock of being seen too clearly, wanted too deeply, or left alone with feelings he can no longer explain away? Because there are forms of intimacy that do not comfort a man. They confront him. They do not merely pull him closer to another person. They pull him closer to the parts of himself he has spent years avoiding. The wound, the pride, the hunger, the fear of surrender, the hidden grief beneath his silence, the ache beneath his desire. And when those things rise, something powerful begins to happen. The divine masculine starts to change. Not because intimacy makes him weak, but because real intimacy is one of the few forces strong enough to crack the mask, shake the ego, and expose the difference between the man he performs and the man he truly is. In this video, we are going to explore the first layer of that transformation. Because before the divine masculine is awakened by love, he is often destabilized by the truth that intimacy reveals. And once that truth touches him deeply enough, he cannot remain the same man. Chapter 1. The Hidden Power of Intimacy. There is a reason intimacy changes a man in ways success never can. A man can build a life. He can build a body. He can build a reputation. He can build discipline, wealth, influence, skill, and image. He can become respected, desired, admired, even envied. And still, something essential inside him can remain untouched. Not because those things are meaningless, but because none of them require him to be fully seen. That is what makes intimacy different. Intimacy does not only ask a man what he can achieve. It asks him who he becomes when another soul comes close enough to touch what he has hidden. And that is where its power begins. Most people think intimacy is soft, romantic, comforting, healing, a place of closeness, warmth, affection, and emotional safety. And yes, intimacy can be all of those things. But real intimacy has another side. It is disruptive. It does not only soothe. It reveals. It does not merely give a man love. It often forces him into self-confrontation. This is why intimacy becomes such a powerful force in the journey of the divine masculine. Because a man can avoid himself in many areas of life. But it becomes much harder to avoid himself when he is standing in front of someone who awakens his heart, exposes his contradictions, and touches emotions he no longer knows how to manage through logic, image, or control. That is the hidden power of intimacy. It bypasses performance. A man may know how to perform strength. He may know how to perform calm. He may know how to perform certainty, detachment, confidence, leadership, even spiritual awareness. But intimacy has a way of slipping beneath all of that. It reaches the places where his rehearsed identity no longer protects him. It asks questions his image cannot answer. It stirs feelings his pride cannot easily contain. And suddenly, the man who seemed so composed starts to feel unstable inside. Why? Because intimacy does not just make him feel. It makes him visible. This is what many men are unprepared for. They think they are entering intimacy for pleasure, connection, affirmation, or companionship. They think they are stepping into a space where they can feel close, feel wanted, feel important, feel chosen. And often, that is part of what happens. But underneath those surface experiences, something much deeper begins. Intimacy starts showing him to himself. It shows him how much of his confidence depends on control, how much of his calm depends on emotional distance, how much of his desire is entangled with loneliness, how much of his attraction is mixed with fear, how much of his silence is not wisdom, but self-protection. That kind of revelation is powerful because it is deeply personal. No lecture can do it the same way. No theory can do it the same way. No outer success can do it the same way. A man may intellectually understand that he has wounds. He may admit, in abstract language, that he has trust issues, vulnerability issues, commitment fears, or emotional patterns from the past. But intimacy makes those things real. Not as concepts, as lived experiences. He does not merely think, I struggle with vulnerability. He feels his body tense when someone asks him a sincere emotional question. He does not merely think, I have a fear of being seen. He feels panic rising when a woman understands him more quickly than he expected. He does not merely think, I might avoid closeness. He feels the urge to withdraw the moment the connection becomes too real. This is why intimacy has such transformative power. It turns unconscious patterns into undeniable experience. It drags what was hidden into the light. And for many men, this is shocking. Not because they never had feelings, but because they did not realize how much was buried beneath their usual self-image. A man may have lived for years believing he is fine, strong, independent, clear-minded, in control, above emotional chaos. Then intimacy enters. And suddenly he is restless, preoccupied, reactive, drawn in, afraid, hopeful, confused, softened, destabilized. The old self-understanding starts to crack. He begins to realize that he is not as detached as he thought, not as invulnerable as he imagined, not as unaffected as he performed. This is often the first stage of change. Not transformation yet. Exposure. And exposure can feel like a crisis, because the divine masculine does not initially awaken through comfort alone. Often, he awakens because intimacy interrupts his illusions. It breaks the smooth narrative he has built about himself. It reveals the places where he is split, the places where he wants love but resists surrender, the places where he longs for connection but fears the demands it would place on him, the places where he desires depth but still lives from habits that can only sustain distance. This is the hidden power of intimacy. It does not let contradiction sleep forever. It reveals where a man is divided between what he says he wants and what he is actually prepared to embody. For example, a man may say he wants a deep, spiritually connected, emotionally intelligent woman. He may say he is tired of superficiality. He may believe he is ready for something real. But when that something real arrives, when he encounters a woman whose presence pulls him beneath the surface, he may find himself reacting in ways that surprise him. He becomes guarded, inconsistent, overly analytical, emotionally flooded, hot and cold, drawn in then distant, honest one moment, hard to reach the next. Why does this happen? Because the fantasy of depth is easier than the reality of it. The fantasy allows him to admire intimacy. The reality asks him to be altered by it. And alteration is costly. It costs him the old mask, the old defenses, the old strategies, the old ways of staying in control. That is why intimacy becomes a threshold between performance and truth, between ego and transformation, between the man who manages appearances and the man who begins to face himself honestly. Many men spend years avoiding this threshold, not always consciously. Sometimes they call it bad timing. Sometimes they call it needing space. Sometimes they call it not being ready. Sometimes they call it complexity. Sometimes they call it protecting their peace. And to be fair, sometimes timing is real. Sometimes space is needed. Sometimes confusion exists. But often, beneath the explanation is something more unsettling. They are standing at the edge of real intimacy, and they know somewhere deep inside that if they step all the way in, something false in them will have to die. That is what makes intimacy so powerful. It is not merely connection. It is initiation. It initiates a man into deeper truth, whether he welcomes it or not. It shows him where he is emotionally underdeveloped, where he still depends on admiration, where he uses distance as power, where he fears surrender, where he confuses longing with weakness, where he wants the experience of love more than the transformation love requires. These revelations are not comfortable, but they are sacred, because no man can become divine while remaining fully loyal to illusion. Something must expose the split between his outer identity and his inner condition. Something must disturb the sleep. Something must make it impossible to keep calling avoidance peace and emotional exile strength. Very often, intimacy is that something. And the reason it is so powerful is because it speaks two languages at once. It speaks the language of attraction, and it speaks the language of truth. First, it draws him in. Then it undoes him. First, it feels beautiful. Then it becomes clarifying. First, it awakens desire. Then it reveals what desire was hiding. That sequence matters. Because many men can handle attraction. They know how to navigate chemistry. They know how to move inside tension, flirting, pursuit, seduction, and emotional pull. But when the connection shifts from attraction into revelation, many become unsettled. Because attraction lets a man feel powerful. Revelation makes him feel seen. And those are not the same. Feeling powerful can inflate the ego. Feeling seen can humble it. Feeling desired can reassure him. Feeling known can challenge him. Feeling pursued can comfort his self-image. Feeling understood can threaten every defense he has built. This is why the intimacy triggers that change the divine masculine are so potent. They do not simply excite him. They reveal him. They turn closeness into a mirror. They convert desire into self-knowledge. They expose the inner architecture of a man's soul. Suddenly, he is not just dealing with another person. He is dealing with himself. With his fear of being enough. His fear of being needed. His fear of needing too much. His fear of losing control. His fear of emotional dependence. His fear that if someone really sees him, the polished version may not survive. This is where many masculine awakenings truly begin. Not with confidence. With disruption. Not with mastery. With confrontation. Not with certainty. With the collapse of old certainty. And yet, this is not a tragedy. It is mercy. Because what intimacy exposes is precisely what has been waiting to be healed, disciplined, purified, and integrated. A man cannot awaken what he refuses to see. He cannot transform what he keeps hidden beneath charm, ambition, silence, or detachment. He cannot become whole while remaining committed to the identity that keeps him fragmented. So intimacy enters as a sacred disturbance. It shakes the foundations. It interrupts the routine of self-protection. It makes him feel what he would rather analyze. It makes him confront what he would rather outrun. And if he is willing, truly willing, it becomes one of the greatest spiritual forces of his life. Not because another person saves him, but because closeness becomes the place where truth can no longer be postponed. This is the first thing we must understand about the divine masculine. He is not changed merely by being loved. He is changed by what love reveals. He is not transformed merely because someone beautiful enters his life. He is transformed because beauty, when joined with intimacy, exposes both his longing and his lack of readiness. He is not awakened by romance alone. He is awakened by the collision between his heart and the truth. That collision is powerful. It can break illusions, rearrange desires, humble pride, call forth maturity, strip away counterfeit strength, reveal where discipline is missing, reveal where purpose has been abandoned, reveal where the soul is asking for a higher kind of manhood. And that is why intimacy has hidden power. Because beneath the softness, beneath the chemistry, beneath the emotional pull, it carries the force of revelation. It reveals what a man has built, what he has avoided, what he still fears, what he still worships, what he truly longs for beneath all the noise. And once that revelation begins, the old life becomes harder to return to. He may try. He may retreat. He may delay. He may rationalize. He may even run for a season. But something has already happened. He has been touched by truth. And the man who has truly been touched by truth is never completely comfortable in illusion again. That is the hidden power of intimacy. It does not just bring two people closer. It brings a man closer to the self he has not yet become. It does not just awaken feelings. It awakens consequence. It asks him, will you keep performing? Will you keep hiding? Will you keep reaching for closeness while resisting transformation? Or will you let this connection, this mirror, this trigger, this sacred disturbance become the beginning of a different life? That is the question hidden inside intimacy. And for the divine masculine, how he answers it changes everything. Chapter 2. Why the divine masculine changes through triggers, not comfort. There is a reason comfort rarely changes a man at the deepest level. Comfort can soothe him. Comfort can reassure him. Comfort can make him feel accepted, admired, desired, even temporarily understood. But comfort by itself does not always transform him. In many cases, it allows him to remain exactly as he is. And that is why the divine masculine so often changes through triggers, not comfort. This truth can be difficult to accept, especially in a world that romanticizes healing as something soft, gentle, and continuously affirming. Many people want to believe that if a man is simply loved enough, if he is simply supported enough, if he is simply given enough patience, then he will naturally open, rise, soften, and become whole. Sometimes love does help in this way. But not always. Because a man can receive care and still remain defended. He can receive affection and still remain divided. He can be deeply loved and still avoid the very truths that love is trying to bring to the surface. Why? Because what keeps the sleeping masculine asleep is not merely a lack of love. It is often a loyalty to old survival structures. And those structures do not collapse just because comfort is present. They collapse when something shakes them. A trigger does precisely that. A trigger interrupts the familiar. It disturbs the system. It bypasses the polished identity and touches the hidden wound, the hidden fear, the hidden hunger, the hidden grief, the hidden shame. That is why triggers can feel so disproportionate. A small moment can produce a massive reaction. A simple sentence can destabilize him. A woman's silence can affect him more than her words. A moment of emotional closeness can stir panic that seems larger than the situation itself. A boundary can make him feel exposed. A loss of control can make him feel undone. On the surface, it may seem irrational. But at the deeper level, the trigger is not about the present moment alone. It is about what the present moment touches. That is what makes it powerful. Comfort usually speaks to the part of a man that wants relief. A trigger speaks to the part that needs awakening. These are not the same. A man may want relief from loneliness, but still need awakening from illusion. He may want affection, but still need confrontation with his emotional immaturity. He may want connection, but still need exposure of the fear that prevents him from sustaining real intimacy. He may want a woman's softness, but still need to face the ego that treats softness as something to receive rather than something to honor. This is where many misunderstand the path of the divine masculine. They think awakening begins when he feels safest. But often it begins when he feels most revealed. When something in him is no longer comfortable staying asleep. The divine masculine rarely awakens because life stays easy. He awakens because something becomes impossible to ignore. A trigger creates that impossibility. It can come in the form of a woman who sees through him too quickly. A connection that affects him more deeply than he expected. A moment of emotional exposure he cannot control with charm. A silence that forces him to feel. A distance that reveals attachment. A rejection that strips away false confidence. A boundary that mirrors his lack of discipline. A loss that reveals what he was not ready to value properly when it was in front of him. These moments sting because they collapse fantasy. And the masculine ego does not enjoy the collapse of fantasy. Fantasy says, I am in control. The trigger says, then why are you shaking? Fantasy says, I can leave whenever I want. The trigger says, then why does this distance haunt you? Fantasy says, I am detached. The trigger says, then why are you restless at night? Fantasy says, I know exactly who I am. The trigger says, then why does being seen feel so threatening? A trigger is powerful because it does not argue with the mask. It goes underneath it. It reveals the gap between the identity a man performs and the reality he is living inside. That gap is often where awakening begins. Because before a man can change, he has to be interrupted. Not mildly inspired. Interrupted. Interrupted in the story he tells himself. Interrupted in the coping patterns he calls personality. Interrupted in the emotional strategies he has mistaken for strength. Interrupted in the illusion that he can keep receiving the gifts of intimacy without becoming the kind of man intimacy requires. This is why comfort alone often fails to transform the divine masculine. Comfort can be received by the mask. The mask can enjoy being loved. The mask can enjoy being understood. The mask can enjoy admiration, attention, forgiveness, emotional availability, and patience. But a trigger reaches the hidden architecture. It exposes the places where he is still built on fear. And once fear is exposed, he has a choice. He can defend it, or he can descend into it and begin to understand it. That choice is the beginning of real change. Imagine a man who has spent years appearing composed, independent, and emotionally self-contained. He believes this is maturity. He believes this is strength. He believes this is how he stays safe and respected. Then he encounters a connection that makes him feel more than he expected. Suddenly, he is thinking more, feeling more, reacting more, questioning more. He cannot maintain the same easy distance. What happened? Did the woman create weakness in him? No. She revealed where he was already vulnerable. That is the difference. The trigger does not invent the fracture. It exposes it. And exposure is uncomfortable because it removes the protection of ignorance. Before the trigger, a man can live inside his patterns without naming them. After the trigger, he begins to feel them in real time. He notices the urge to withdraw. He notices the fear of losing control. He notices the need to maintain emotional advantage. He notices the panic that rises when closeness becomes real. He notices how much he wants to be chosen while still resisting the surrender of choosing fully in return. This self-noticing can feel brutal. Because suddenly he can no longer say, "This is just how I am," with the same innocence. Now he sees cost. He sees how his avoidance affects connection. How his inconsistency creates instability. How his emotional distance is not only protecting him, but preventing him from becoming who he could be. How the very parts of himself he once trusted may actually be the barriers standing between him and a more sacred life. That is what a trigger does. It makes unconscious cost visible. And once cost becomes visible, a man is no longer as free to remain asleep. He may still choose sleep. He may still run. He may still rationalize. He may still blame circumstances, timing, the other person, his past, or the complexity of the connection. But somewhere inside, he knows something has been exposed. That knowing matters. Because the soul of a man can tolerate many things, but once it has tasted truth, illusion becomes harder to enjoy. This is why triggers are often the doorway to masculine transformation. Not because pain is automatically noble. Not because suffering is the goal. But because pain can break through denial faster than comfort often can. Comfort can let a man remain charmingly unfinished. A trigger forces unfinishedness into the open. Comfort can coexist with self-deception. A trigger confronts self-deception. Comfort can let him stay in theory. A trigger puts him into living reality. This is especially true in intimacy. A man may think he is ready for depth until depth begins making demands on his nervous system. His habits, his honesty, his consistency, his pride. He may believe he is spiritually mature until he is confronted with a woman whose presence evokes both longing and fear. He may think he understands love until love no longer feels like fantasy and starts feeling like responsibility. He may think he is strong until he realizes how quickly he uses distance when emotional truth threatens the image he has built. None of this means he is broken beyond repair. It means he is being shown where repair is needed. That is why triggers, though uncomfortable, are sacred. They are revelations in emotional form. They say, here is where you still fear surrender. Here is where you still confuse control with strength. Here is where your desire outruns your discipline. Here is where you want closeness without the cost of transformation. Here is where your old self is trying to survive inside a life that is calling you higher. These revelations can change a man, but only if he stops treating the trigger as an enemy. This is crucial. Many men experience a trigger and immediately move into defense. They blame the woman. They label the connection toxic too quickly. They reduce the intensity to confusion. They retreat into cold analysis. They try to regain power by pulling away, becoming vague, or reasserting emotional distance. Why? Because the ego experiences the trigger as a threat. And in one sense it is. It is a threat to false power. A threat to the mask. A threat to the survival identity. A threat to the version of masculinity that was built on never needing too much, never revealing too much, never feeling too much, never being touched too deeply by anything that could humble him. But what threatens the ego may save the soul. That is the paradox. The trigger feels dangerous because it challenges who he has been. But it is precisely that challenge that makes awakening possible. Without the challenge, he may continue repeating the same patterns with different faces. Different women, same distance. Different chemistry, same avoidance. Different heartbreak, same rationalization. Different spiritual language, same emotional immaturity. The trigger interrupts the repetition. It says, in effect, no, you cannot pass through this one unchanged. That is why certain connections feel so fated, so disruptive, so unforgettable. Not always because they are meant to last forever in form, but because they are meant to expose something permanent in truth. A man may never forget the woman who triggered his awakening, not simply because he loved her, but because her presence disrupted the architecture of his sleep. She became the mirror he could not comfortably look away from, the boundary he could not charm past, the distance he could not easily forget, the intimacy he could not reduce to mere attraction, the loss that made excuses sound hollow, the truth that remained echoing long after the moment itself passed. That is not ordinary comfort. That is sacred interruption. And sacred interruption is one of the greatest catalysts of the divine masculine. Because ultimately, the divine masculine does not rise just because he is soothed. He rises when he is summoned. Summoned out of performance. Summoned out of illusion. Summoned out of emotional exile. Summoned out of the lesser habits that once defined his manhood. Summoned into a deeper honesty, a deeper discipline, a deeper reverence for love, truth, and purpose. A trigger issues that summons. Not politely. Not gently. But clearly. It says, wake up. Look. Feel. Tell the truth. Stop calling this peace. Stop calling this strength. Stop pretending you are untouched. Stop asking for sacred intimacy while resisting sacred responsibility. That is why triggers matter. They are thresholds. And every threshold asks a question. Will you retreat into the old self? Or will you let this discomfort become the doorway to a higher one? This is where the divine masculine begins to separate from the sleeping masculine. The sleeping masculine reacts to triggers by seeking control. The awakening masculine begins to ask what the trigger is revealing. The sleeping masculine says, how do I stop feeling this? The awakening masculine asks, why does this shake me so deeply? The sleeping masculine seeks escape. The awakening masculine seeks meaning. That shift is everything. Because meaning transforms pain. Meaning turns disruption into instruction. Meaning turns emotional shock into spiritual initiation. And once a man begins to approach triggers this way, he stops seeing them merely as emotional inconvenience. He starts seeing them as invitations. Invitations to become more integrated, more honest, more humble, more disciplined, more capable of holding love without turning it into a battlefield between ego and soul. This is why the divine masculine changes through triggers, not comfort. Because triggers expose what comfort can soothe but not transform. Because triggers reveal where the old self is still in charge. Because triggers force reality into contact with the image. Because triggers make it harder to keep lying about who he is and what he is ready for. Because triggers do not just touch his heart. They challenge his construction. And the man willing to stay with that challenge, to learn from it rather than merely defend against it, begins to change in ways comfort alone could never produce. He becomes less interested in relief and more interested in truth. Less interested in preserving image and more interested in becoming real. Less interested in controlling intimacy and more interested in being refined by it. That is the beginning of awakening. Not when everything feels easy, but when the soul is shaken awake by a truth it can no longer comfortably deny. And once that shaking has begun, the old masculine can never fully sleep in peace again. Chapter 3. Trigger 1. Being truly seen beyond the mask. There is a kind of intimacy that does not begin with touch. It begins with recognition. A look that lingers too long. A question that cuts too deep. A silence that somehow says, "I can feel what you are not saying." A presence that does not merely admire the man in front of her, but senses the fracture beneath him. And for many men, that is where the real disruption starts. Not when they are desired. Not when they are praised. Not even when they are loved. But when they are seen. Truly seen. Because being desired can still leave the mask intact. Being admired can still feed the performance. Being wanted can still allow a man to hide behind charm, strength, intelligence, status, sexuality, composure, or mystery. But being seen is different. Being seen threatens the mask. And this is why it becomes one of the most shocking intimacy triggers in the transformation of the divine masculine. A man can spend years building a self that looks powerful from the outside. He learns how to speak with certainty, how to move with control, how to project confidence, how to remain hard to read, how to appear calm in situations that would rattle others. He may even learn how to appear deep, thoughtful, spiritually aware, emotionally intelligent. But underneath all of that, there is often another self. The guarded self. The younger self. The unseen self. The self that still fears not being enough unless he is impressive. The self that still believes vulnerability weakens his value. The self that learned long ago that survival depends on control. So he performs. Not always consciously. Not always maliciously. Often automatically. He performs competence. He performs detachment. He performs steadiness. He performs mystery. He performs self-sufficiency. He performs a version of masculinity that can be admired without ever having to be fully known. And for a while this works. It protects him. It gets results. It earns attention. It reduces exposure. It keeps him from feeling too vulnerable, too needy, too transparent. Then he meets someone whose presence disturbs that entire system. She does not only react to the version of him that the world sees. She senses what he has hidden behind it. She notices the pain beneath the pride, the softness beneath the control, the loneliness beneath the confidence, the fear beneath the silence, the longing beneath the distance. And suddenly, the man who has spent so much energy managing perception begins to feel strangely unsteady. Why? Because to be seen beyond the mask is one of the most intimate things that can happen to a man. It is also one of the most terrifying. Most men think they are afraid of rejection. Sometimes they are. But often, what they fear even more is accurate recognition. Because rejection still allows the mask to survive. He can say, "She didn't understand me." He can tell himself, "It just wasn't right." He can preserve the image and move on. But accurate recognition leaves him with less room to hide. If she sees him clearly, not just his charm, not just his strength, not just his appeal, but his wounds, his contradictions, his hesitations, his emotional evasions, then he is left facing a far more uncomfortable possibility. What if the deepest issue is not that he is unseen? What if the deepest issue is that he is seen, and now he must decide whether he is willing to be real? This is the true shock of this intimacy trigger. A man may have spent years craving depth, telling himself that he wants a woman who truly understands him, who gets past the surface, who recognizes the man behind the role. But when that actually happens, when someone's presence reaches beyond the script, he may find himself reacting in ways that confuse even him. He may become quieter, more restless, more careful with his words, more distant, more intense, more contradictory. Drawn in one moment, withdrawn the next. Why does he do this? Because part of him feels relieved to be recognized, and another part feels endangered by it. Relieved, because something in every man longs to stop performing, longs to stop carrying the exhausting burden of the image, longs to be known without having to constantly earn it, longs to rest in a place where he does not have to impress in order to matter. But endangered, because being seen threatens the identities he has used to stay safe. If she sees through the confidence, what happens to the role? If she sees through the detachment, what happens to the protection? If she sees through the composure, what happens to the illusion of control? If she sees the hunger, the tenderness, the uncertainty, what happens to the masculine self he has spent years constructing? This is why accurate recognition can trigger a man more deeply than seduction ever could. Seduction lets him remain powerful. Recognition makes him honest. And honesty is expensive. It asks for more than chemistry. It asks for congruence. A man can handle attraction while still being divided inside. He can handle flirting. He can handle desire. He can handle fantasy. He can handle emotional tension. But once he is seen, truly seen, the whole dynamic changes. Now he is not just managing connection. He is standing before truth. And truth asks a dangerous question. Will you keep hiding, or will you let yourself be known? This question reaches into the very heart of masculine awakening. Because the sleeping masculine often survives by controlling what others can access. He reveals enough to stay compelling, enough to stay interesting, enough to maintain closeness without surrendering too much actual transparency. He may appear emotionally present in moments. He may even be deeply sincere in those moments. But he still preserves a private chamber within himself, a place where he can remain unchallenged by full exposure. Then someone comes along who does not force the door, but somehow senses what is behind it. That kind of woman can change everything. Not because she is chasing him, not because she is interrogating him, not because she is trying to fix him, but because her presence itself becomes a mirror. She sees how much of his peace is actually emotional distance. She sees how often his silence is self-protection. She sees how his confidence sometimes trembles beneath the surface. She sees the moments when his words and energy do not fully match. She sees the little fractures in the polished structure. And perhaps most disturbing of all, she sees the man he could become if he stopped hiding from himself. That kind of seeing can feel holy. It can also feel unbearable. Because to be seen in possibility is beautiful. But to be seen in contradiction is painful. A man may want to be admired for his potential. He may not want his current limitations illuminated at the same time. Yet intimacy rarely separates the two. Real intimacy says, I can feel both your depth and your fear, your longing and your resistance, your strength and your unfinishedness. That is a profound experience. And it often triggers one of two responses. Either he leans toward truth, or he retreats into defense. If he leans toward truth, this moment becomes the beginning of awakening. He starts realizing that what unsettles him is not her intensity, not her standards, not her emotional depth, but the fact that he can no longer comfortably maintain the same distance from himself. Her seeing has disrupted his illusion. He must now confront the difference between how he appears and how he actually functions in intimacy. But if he retreats into defense, he may become elusive, vague, inconsistent, harder to read. He may pull back just as the connection is deepening. He may rationalize his discomfort as incompatibility. He may convince himself that things are moving too fast, getting too complicated, becoming too intense. Sometimes those explanations are partly true. But often there is another truth underneath. He is reacting to the shock of being seen beyond the mask. This trigger is especially powerful because it hits an old wound many men carry without naming: the wound of conditional worth. At some point in life, many men learned that being lovable required performance. Be strong. Be capable. Be calm. Be useful. Be impressive. Be desirable. Be composed. Be in control. So they learned to identify with the version of themselves that earned approval. But if intimacy begins reaching underneath that version, old fear rises. If I am known beneath what I can do, beneath what I can project, beneath how I look, beneath how well I lead or impress, will I still be enough? That question lives deep in many men. And when it is activated, the reaction can be intense. Because now intimacy is no longer abstract. It is personal. It is existential. It is no longer just about whether he likes her, whether she likes him, whether the chemistry is strong, whether the timing works. It becomes about whether he can survive being known. That is why this trigger changes the divine masculine so powerfully. It does not simply awaken romance. It awakens identity. It forces him to confront what he has built himself on. Has he built himself on truth? Or on presentation? Has he built himself on inner alignment? Or on a carefully managed image? Has he become strong? Or merely hard to read? These questions matter because the divine masculine cannot be born from performance alone. It must emerge from integration. A man has to become willing to let his inner life come into the light. Not all at once. Not recklessly. Not theatrically. But honestly. And being seen is often the first event that makes such honesty unavoidable. Consider the man who always seems composed. He is thoughtful, self-contained, respected, perhaps even admired for his calm. Then he encounters a woman who does not just compliment his strength. She names his sadness, or gently points to the wall he hides behind, or quietly says something like, "You act like nothing gets to you, but I don't think that's true." That simple moment can shake him. Not because the words are harsh, but because they are accurate. Accuracy is what destabilizes the ego. Flattery can be absorbed by the mask. Accuracy penetrates it. And once he feels penetrated in that way, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, he may realize that this connection is no longer merely pleasurable. It is revelatory. That is when intimacy becomes a trigger for transformation. Because now he has been invited into a different kind of masculinity. One that does not rely on emotional camouflage. One that does not confuse being unreadable with being strong. One that does not treat tenderness like a threat. One that can allow itself to be seen without collapsing into shame. This is the threshold. And thresholds are never easy. To cross this threshold, a man must begin releasing the belief that his worth depends on remaining polished. He must let go of the idea that being emotionally visible makes him weak. He must stop interpreting recognition as danger and start understanding it as invitation. An invitation to become more real, more integrated, more intimate with truth, more available to the kind of love that cannot be built on disguise. This does not happen instantly. Most men do not move from defense to openness in one clean motion. There is usually tension, resistance, confusion, moments of retreat, moments of longing, moments when the old mask feels safer and the deeper self feels too exposed. But once he has truly been seen, something irreversible begins. He can no longer fully enjoy the old performance with the same innocence. He can no longer pretend that the mask is the whole man. He can no longer call distance maturity without remembering the moment he felt his own tenderness rise under someone's gaze. He can no longer keep saying, "This is just who I am," without hearing the deeper question underneath. Is it really who you are? Or is it who you became to avoid being hurt? That question can change a life. Because the divine masculine does not awaken when a man becomes more impressive. He awakens when he becomes more honest. And this first trigger, being truly seen beyond the mask, is often the very beginning of that honesty. It strips away the luxury of self-deception. It reveals the man beneath the role. It exposes how much energy has gone into being admired instead of being known. It confronts him with the possibility that the life he has built may still be missing the deepest thing: inner congruence. And yet, this trigger is not cruel. It is mercy. Because what does accurate recognition really offer a man? Not humiliation. Not exposure for its own sake. It offers him a chance to stop hiding. A chance to become the man he has been imitating from a distance. A chance to let strength and softness exist in the same body. A chance to experience intimacy not as performance, but as truth. A chance to discover that being fully known does not destroy masculinity. It purifies it. That is why this trigger is so shocking. And so sacred. The woman who sees beyond the mask may not realize the full magnitude of what she has activated. But something in him knows. A door has opened. A mirror has appeared. A false self has been disturbed. And once that disturbance begins, the divine masculine is already on the path of change. Because the man who has finally been seen must now decide. Will he retreat further into the mask? Or will he let being seen become the first step toward becoming real? That decision is where the old masculine trembles. And the awakened masculine begins. Chapter 4. Trigger 2. Emotional intimacy he cannot control. There is a kind of closeness a man can manage. He can manage attraction. He can manage flirtation. He can manage tension. He can manage desire, especially when desire still lives on the surface. He can manage the rhythm of pursuit and distance. He can manage how much he reveals. He can manage how much access another person gets. He can manage the image of connection without fully surrendering to its truth. But then there is another kind of closeness. A deeper one. A more dangerous one. Emotional intimacy. Not because emotion is weak, but because emotion reaches places control cannot easily follow. And when a man encounters emotional intimacy he cannot control, something profound begins to happen. The structure he has used to feel powerful starts to shake. The methods that once kept him safe stop working. The identity built on composure, distance, mystery, or self-containment begins to feel less like strength and more like strain. This is why emotional intimacy becomes such a shocking trigger in the transformation of the divine masculine. Because many men can navigate desire while staying defended. Far fewer can navigate emotional closeness without feeling internally exposed. Desire can still let him feel powerful. Emotional intimacy makes him feel reachable. That difference is everything. A man may be perfectly at ease when connection stays playful, magnetic, suggestive, or undefined. He may know how to lead in that space. He may know how to regulate the pace, create tension, preserve mystery, and maintain emotional advantage. He may even appear deeply connected while still holding a quiet part of himself back, a hidden center from which he continues managing the entire experience. Then something shifts. The conversation becomes more honest. The silence becomes more meaningful. The emotional atmosphere deepens. He feels cared for in a way that is no longer abstract. He feels understood in a way that is no longer flattering, but intimate. He begins to sense that this person is no longer simply interacting with his energy. She is touching his interior. And suddenly, the same man who once seemed so composed feels disturbed by how much the connection is getting inside him. Why? Because emotional intimacy removes the illusion of distance. A man may believe he is still in control as long as he can regulate contact, words, pacing, and access. But emotional intimacy crosses barriers without asking permission from the ego. It reaches past strategy, past performance, past the outer script. It settles in the body, the nervous system, the hidden emotional memory. He begins thinking about her when he does not want to. He replays certain conversations. He feels the weight of what was said or not said. He notices himself wanting to explain more, wanting to be understood more clearly, wanting her presence not just physically, but emotionally. That last part is often where the real trigger starts. Because a man may think he only wants attraction until emotional intimacy reveals that what he really wants is to be met. And being met is far more destabilizing than being desired. Being desired can still feed the image. Being emotionally met touches the unmet places. The places he has kept disciplined. The places he has kept private. the places he has trained himself not to need too much from anyone. This is where the sleeping masculine often becomes frightened. Not always consciously. Not always with dramatic behavior. Sometimes very quietly. He becomes slower to reply. More inward. Less spontaneous. More analytical. More careful. He may feel deeply drawn and deeply resistant at the same time. He may tell himself he needs to think. Needs space. Needs to slow down. Needs to understand what this is. Sometimes that is true. But often there is another truth underneath. He is trying to regain control over an intimacy that has moved beyond the range of his usual defenses. Because emotional intimacy has a way of revealing to a man how much of his life has been built around not needing too much, not feeling too much, not depending too deeply, not giving another human being enough access to truly unsettle the identity he has built. Then someone arrives who unsettles it anyway. Not through manipulation, not through drama, not through force, but through sincerity, presence, emotional congruence, a kind of closeness that asks nothing theatrical, yet somehow makes it impossible for him to remain untouched. This is why emotional intimacy can feel almost unbearable to a masculine ego built on self-protection. It is not loud enough to fight, not obvious enough to dismiss, not shallow enough to enjoy casually. It simply gets inside. And once it gets inside, it starts asking silent questions. Why does this affect you so much? Why does this person's emotional presence matter to you in ways you did not predict? Why do you feel the urge to move closer and pull away at the same time? Why does sincerity make you nervous? Why does being cared for sometimes feel more dangerous than being judged? These are not surface questions. They go to the roots. Because what a man cannot control in emotional intimacy is often not the other person. It is himself, his reactions, his tenderness, his attachment, his fear, his need, his longing to stay in control, while simultaneously longing to let go of control and rest. That is the split. And until that split is faced honestly, emotional intimacy will keep feeling like a threat instead of a gift. Many men were not taught how to receive emotional closeness without defensiveness. They were taught how to perform, how to provide, how to pursue, how to endure, how to stay useful, how to stay composed. But they were rarely taught how to sit inside mutual emotional reality without needing to dominate it, define it too quickly, or retreat from it when it begins touching vulnerable places. So when real emotional intimacy appears, the body often reacts before the mind understands. He may feel restless, irritated, softened, afraid, obsessive, protective, withdrawn, pulled in, emotionally overwhelmed by small things. He may not know why a simple moment hits so deeply. Why one honest look, one heartfelt conversation, one vulnerable exchange, one quiet act of care lingers for days. That is because emotional intimacy is not merely informational. It is penetrative. It does not just tell him something. It enters him. And what it enters, it begins to illuminate. It illuminates where he has been emotionally malnourished, where he has confused independence with disconnection, where he has learned to survive through control rather than through trust, where he has become more skilled at managing perception than at sharing truth, where he wants love, but only if love does not require him to become a more integrated man. This is why emotional intimacy he cannot control is one of the great thresholds of masculine awakening. Because it removes a luxury many men rely on. The luxury of staying partial. He can no longer be half present without feeling the cost. He can no longer hide behind clever language if the other person is responding to his deeper emotional reality. He can no longer keep pretending he is unaffected when his whole inner world has started, reorganizing around what this closeness has revealed. The ego hates this. The soul often needs it. That is why one of the most painful experiences for a sleeping masculine is not heartbreak itself, but emotional intimacy that exposes how deeply he has avoided his own heart. He may have believed he was strong because he did not need much. Now he discovers that part of him has always needed more than he allowed himself to feel. He may have believed he was free because he stayed detached. Now he discovers his detachment was partly fear of being impacted. He may have believed he was peaceful because he stayed self-contained. Now he discovers his self-containment was partly resistance to vulnerability. These discoveries are humbling. And humility is exactly what emotional intimacy begins to produce. Not humiliation. Humility. The kind that says, maybe I am not as in control as I thought. Maybe control was never the same as strength. Maybe what unsettles me is not weakness, but truth. Maybe the intensity one feel is not just about another person. Maybe it is about the parts of me I can no longer ignore. That is where transformation begins. Because once a man stops treating emotional intimacy as a threat to masculine power, he can begin seeing it for what it really is. A sacred mirror. A nervous system initiation. A doorway into deeper self-knowledge. An invitation to become a man whose heart is no longer a place he must constantly police. This does not mean he becomes emotionally chaotic. It does not mean he loses discernment. It does not mean every intense emotional connection is holy or meant to last forever. It means that when genuine emotional intimacy touches him, he no longer interprets disturbance only as a problem. He begins asking what the disturbance is revealing. That question changes everything. Because the sleeping masculine asks, how do I regain control? The awakening masculine asks, why does this feel so hard to surrender to? The sleeping masculine asks, why is this person affecting me so much? The awakening masculine asks, what does this effect reveal about my inner condition? The sleeping masculine seeks distance to restore the old identity. The awakening masculine begins considering whether the old identity is what needed to be disturbed in the first place. That is a profound shift. And it often starts with something very simple. A woman who remains emotionally honest. A connection that will not stay superficial. A conversation that leaves him feeling more seen than he is used to. A tenderness that does not feel weak, but impossible to manipulate. A dynamic where emotional intimacy keeps deepening, and he realizes he cannot dominate it with silence, charm, or strategy. In those moments, he stands at a threshold. He can either reduce the connection to something easier, label it too much, or retreat into distance and call it clarity. Or he can admit that emotional intimacy has revealed a level of fear and longing he is no longer willing to hide from. That admission is sacred. Because a man who can finally say, this affects me more than I want to admit, is already closer to truth than the version of himself who stayed polished and unreachable. And truth, once chosen, begins to reorganize masculinity from the inside out. He becomes less interested in emotional advantage, less interested in appearing untouchable, less dependent on ambiguity, less loyal to the old habit of staying unreadable. Instead, he begins to value congruence. He begins to understand that real masculine steadiness is not the ability to avoid being impacted. It is the ability to stay present when impact happens. This is the deeper lesson of this trigger. Emotional intimacy he cannot control is not there to destroy him. It is there to expose what kind of man he becomes when control is no longer enough. Does he shut down? Does he retreat? Does he become vague? Does he blame the connection for showing him what he was not ready to see? Or does he begin the slower, braver work of letting intimacy refine him? That work is not glamorous. It may involve admitting fear, admitting emotional hunger, admitting that his old model of masculinity did not prepare him for depth, admitting that he used distance not only for peace, but for protection, admitting that he has often preferred to be admired rather than emotionally known. These are not small admissions, but they are doorways, because the divine masculine does not awaken when a man is most comfortable. He awakens when intimacy asks him to stop confusing control with safety. He awakens when he realizes that the deepest parts of him cannot be healed by managing emotional distance forever. He awakens when he sees that the urge to control intimacy is often the very thing preventing him from receiving its medicine. He awakens when he understands that closeness is not the enemy. The false self that cannot survive closeness is. That is why this trigger is so shocking. It does not merely create feelings. It dismantles illusions. The illusion that he is fine because he is composed. The illusion that he is free because he is detached. The illusion that he is strong because he reveals little. The illusion that he can stand at the edge of emotional truth forever without eventually being called further in. And once those illusions begin to crack, the man who is willing to stay with the process starts to change. Not all at once. Not perfectly. But unmistakably. He becomes more honest about what touches him. More reverent about what intimacy is asking of him. More capable of staying present when closeness reaches places that once made him run. More aware that emotional intimacy is not taking his power away. It is showing him where his real power has yet to be built. And that realization can transform everything. Because the man who no longer needs to control emotional intimacy is the man who is finally becoming strong enough to inhabit it. Not dominate it. Not perform inside it. Not manage it from a distance. Inhabit it. With honesty. With tenderness. With self-awareness. With responsibility. With the courage to let his heart be a place of truth rather than a guarded chamber ruled by fear. That is the real initiation hidden inside this trigger. And once a man has felt it, truly felt it, he can never again pretend that intimacy is only about connection. He knows now that intimacy is also about confrontation. About revelation. About the collapse of old emotional power. About the beginning of a masculinity that is no longer built on staying unreachable. Because the moment emotional intimacy moves beyond his control, the old masculine begins to panic. And the awakened masculine begins to be born. Chapter 5. Trigger 3. A woman who stops chasing. There is a moment that changes many men more deeply than passion ever could. It is not the moment she confesses love. Not the moment she reaches for him. Not the moment she tries again to understand, explain, soothe, forgive, or wait. It is the moment she stops. Stops chasing. Stops overextending. Stops filling in the emotional gaps he created. Stops carrying the connection alone. Stops translating his silence into hope. Stops romanticizing his inconsistency. Stops offering endless access to a version of him that still refuses to stand fully in truth. That moment can shake the sleeping masculine to the core. Because many men do not realize how much of their emotional structure has been built around the assumption that certain forms of feminine energy will remain available, even when they themselves are unclear, avoidant, or unfinished. Not forever, perhaps, but long enough. Long enough to keep the possibility alive. Long enough to keep returning when it feels convenient. Long enough to preserve emotional comfort without having to face the full weight of responsibility. And then one day that familiar pattern breaks. She is still herself. Still deep. Still feeling. Still perhaps loving in ways he does not fully understand. But something is different. She is no longer running after the version of him that lives in fragments. And that difference becomes one of the most shocking intimacy triggers of all. Because when a woman stops chasing, she does more than create distance. She removes the cushion between a man and his own truth. As long as she is still reaching, still checking, still hoping, still making room for his ambiguity, he can remain partially insulated from consequence. He can tell himself that things are not ideal, but not lost, that he still has time, that she still feels him, that the connection, however strained, is still available enough to keep him from fully confronting what his patterns are costing. Her pursuit, even if gentle, even if rooted in sincere love, can accidentally become a buffer against masculine self-confrontation. But when she stops, the buffer disappears, and silence begins to speak. Not only her silence, his own. The silence of what he did not say. The silence of what he avoided. The silence of what he felt but never fully honored. The silence of opportunities he assumed would remain open. The silence that reveals how much of the connection he took for granted simply because it kept surviving his lack of integration. This is why her withdrawal can feel so spiritually loud. Because what he loses first is not always the woman herself. Sometimes what he loses first is the illusion of unlimited time. The illusion that he can stay emotionally divided without consequence. The illusion that sacred connection will keep waiting while he remains half awake. The illusion that being deeply felt by someone means he can delay becoming someone trustworthy enough to hold that feeling rightly. When those illusions fall, something raw rises in him. Restlessness, regret, longing, confusion, a sudden awareness of absence. A haunting sense that what once felt emotionally available is no longer leaning toward him in the same way. And for many men, that is when the connection becomes most real. Not because she started loving him more, but because she stopped compensating for what he lacked. This is the hidden power of feminine non-pursuit. It reveals what masculine immaturity was able to ignore while being emotionally fed. A man may have told himself he needed space, needed time, needed clarity, needed fewer expectations, needed something slower, less intense, less demanding. And perhaps in part he believed that. But once she truly stops chasing, he often discovers another truth underneath. What he called pressure was sometimes just the discomfort of being invited into greater honesty. What he called too much was sometimes the mirror of his own unreadiness. What he called confusion was sometimes the tension between the life he wanted to keep and the man he was being asked to become. This is why the stop changes him. As long as she is still trying, he can keep the dynamic alive without fully entering it. As long as she is still reaching, he can remain emotionally partial and still feel connected. As long as she keeps translating his absence into possibility, he does not have to face the full cost of his own distance. But when she stops, his patterns lose their camouflage. Now he must sit with what remains when no one is bridging the gap for him. And what remains is often painful. He notices how much he had been relying on her emotional labor. How much her pursuit softened the edges of his avoidance. How much her willingness to stay engaged allowed him to remain delayed without feeling fully lost. How much her presence gave him comfort, even while he withheld the clarity and steadiness that true intimacy required. This recognition can feel humiliating. Not because she is punishing him, but because reality is. Reality says, you cannot keep receiving the emotional gift of a woman's presence while continually underinvesting in truth. You cannot keep enjoying the light while refusing the discipline needed to tend the fire. You cannot keep asking sacred love to remain available on terms that protect your ego more than they honor the connection. That message lands hardest when she stops chasing. Because now, for the first time, he may feel the connection without the anesthesia of her effort. No more reassurance through her movement toward him. No more comfort through her attempts to understand. No more subtle proof that she is still there, still invested, still emotionally turned in his direction. Now there is space. And space can become a brutal teacher. Space reveals whether he was truly at peace or simply accustomed to being pursued. Space reveals whether his detachment was freedom or just a comfortable position maintained by someone else's devotion. Space reveals whether his silence was wisdom or fear that could hide because she kept trying to close the distance. This is why some men wake up only after the chase ends. Not because feminine withdrawal is a tactic. Not because games are holy. But because absence strips away distortion. It removes the extra emotional padding around his unfinishedness. It confronts him with a quiet question he can no longer avoid. What did I assume would always remain available to me? That question can shatter a man. Because often, the answer is not merely her. The answer is larger. He assumed access would remain. He assumed understanding would remain. He assumed the bridge would remain. He assumed the invitation would remain. He assumed that the feminine heart, once opened, would continue making room for his ambiguity longer than it actually could without breaking itself. And when that assumption fails, he is forced to confront something deeply masculine. Stewardship. Did he steward what was sacred? Or did he simply enjoy it while it was there? This is one of the hardest questions of all. Because many men do feel deeply. They do care. They do sense the rarity of certain connections. They do know, at some level, when something meaningful is in front of them. But feeling is not the same as stewarding. Knowing is not the same as honoring. Being affected is not the same as showing up in a way that protects what affects you. A woman who stops chasing confronts him with that difference. She becomes a boundary without needing to become bitter. A revelation without needing to become loud. A mirror without needing to accuse. Her stillness says what her pursuit never could. It says, I will no longer do your part for you. I will no longer call your inconsistency depth. I will no longer turn your emotional hesitation into a romantic mystery. I will no longer abandon myself to keep a connection alive that you are not yet prepared to hold with clean hands. That message can cut through masculine ego like nothing else. Because the ego often expects feminine endurance. It expects softness to keep adapting. It expects love to keep translating. It expects warmth to keep making exceptions. But when the warmth becomes boundaried, when the softness ceases to chase, the masculine is left alone with his own reflection. And reflection is what changes him. At first, he may react with pride. He may tell himself it does not matter. He may harden. Distract himself. Seek relief elsewhere. Try to regain control by becoming colder than he really feels. But if the connection was real, if the intimacy touched him deeply enough, those defenses rarely hold forever. Sooner or later, the emptiness behind them begins to speak. Not an emptiness caused by her absence alone. An emptiness caused by his own delay. This is what makes the experience transformative. He begins to realize that the ache is not only, I miss her. Sometimes it is, I am finally feeling what I kept postponing. Finally feeling the value of what was there. Finally feeling the cost of emotional immaturity. Finally feeling how much he was protected from full loss by the fact that she kept trying. Now that she has stopped, he is standing in unbuffered truth. And truth asks harder questions than longing alone. Why did you wait? Why did you stay divided for so long? Why did you let fear govern what mattered? Why did you expect sacred things to remain accessible while you withheld the level of presence they deserved? Why did it take her absence for you to honor what her presence had already revealed? These questions are not punishment. They are initiation. Because the divine masculine often begins rising in the very place where his ego is no longer being fed. When she stops chasing, he loses more than external attention. He loses the false sense of leverage. He loses the illusion that he can set the pace indefinitely without spiritual consequence. He loses the comfort of knowing that someone else is still energetically keeping the door open. That loss can become a turning point. Not all men use it that way. Some grow more defended. Some turn cynical. Some keep searching for another dynamic that will let them stay unchallenged. But the man who is ready for awakening receives her non-pursuit differently. He begins to understand it as sacred interruption. Not rejection of his essence. Refusal of his fragmentation. Not proof that he is unlovable. Proof that love cannot keep partnering with the parts of him that avoid integrity. This realization changes the entire meaning of her withdrawal. It is no longer just, she left. It becomes, reality stopped protecting me from the consequences of who I still was. That is a painful sentence. It is also a holy one. Because only when a man stops blaming the silence can he begin hearing what it came to teach. And what it teaches is profound. That love is not measured only by who feels the most. It is measured by who becomes truthful enough to carry what they feel. That sacred intimacy is not maintained by emotional longing alone. It is maintained by presence, discipline, courage, and alignment. That no matter how deep the chemistry, no matter how rare the connection, a woman eventually has to stop chasing if her chasing is keeping a man asleep. This is not cruelty. It is reverence. Reverence for herself. Reverence for love. Reverence for truth. And if he is wise, he will one day reverence it too. Because the woman who stops chasing often becomes more transformative in stillness than she ever was in pursuit. In pursuit, she may have comforted him. In stillness, she reveals him. In pursuit, she may have made him feel wanted. In stillness, she makes him confront whether he knew how to honor being wanted. In pursuit, she may have bridged the gap. In stillness, she shows him the gap was his to cross. That is why this trigger changes the divine masculine so deeply. It does not merely create pain. It removes illusion. And when illusion falls, awakening becomes possible. The man who once thought he held the emotional advantage may now realize that true power was never in being chased. True power would have been in being clear, being steady, being honest, being disciplined enough to meet what was rare while it was in front of him. This realization can break him open. And sometimes being broken open is the beginning of becoming real. Because once she stops chasing, he has to decide. Will he remain the man who only understands value through absence? Or will he become the man who learns, finally, what it means to rise before sacred things are gone? That decision is where the old masculine grieves, and where the awakened masculine begins. Chapter 6. Trigger 4. Desire that turns into vulnerability. At first, he thinks it is simple. At first, he thinks it is desire. Chemistry. Attraction. Tension. The thrill of being drawn toward someone whose presence stirs his body, sharpens his attention, and fills the air with possibility. He tells himself it is physical. Maybe emotional, a little. Maybe spiritual, in the vague and poetic sense. But still manageable. Still familiar. Still something he can place inside the category of want. And that is important, because want feels safer than need. Want gives him options. Want allows distance. Want can be indulged, delayed, controlled, reframed. Want does not require confession. Want does not force him to stand naked before his own heart. So he calls it desire. But then something begins to happen. The desire does not stay where he put it. It deepens. It lingers. It follows him into silence. It survives after the moment is over. It starts affecting not just what he wants to do, but what he feels, what he hopes, what he fears, what he cannot stop replaying in his mind. And slowly, almost against his will, desire begins turning into vulnerability. This is one of the most shocking intimacy triggers in the transformation of the divine masculine. Because many men know how to carry desire. Far fewer know how to carry what is revealed when desire stops being surface appetite and becomes emotional exposure. Desire, in its early form, can still leave a man feeling powerful. It can make him feel chosen, alive, magnetic, potent. It can feed confidence. It can energize pursuit. It can live inside fantasy, where the ego still has room to perform. But vulnerability changes the field. Vulnerability asks, why does this matter so much? Why does her presence stay with you? Why do you feel restless after she leaves? Why does longing suddenly feel less like pleasure and more like ache? Why does your attraction now carry fear? That is the turning point. Because once desire begins to carry fear, tenderness, emotional dependence, and the possibility of loss, a man realizes he is no longer dealing with simple attraction. He is dealing with exposure. And exposure is far more difficult for the sleeping masculine than desire alone. A man can desire and still remain defended. He can desire and still keep one hand on the door. He can desire and still preserve the illusion that he is unattached, self-contained, above emotional entanglement. But once desire turns into vulnerability, that illusion begins to collapse. Now he is not just wanting. He is affected. He is not just pulled. He is opened. He is not just interested. He is at risk. This is where many men begin to panic, though they may not call it panic. They call it confusion, intensity, bad timing, a need for space, a need to slow things down, a need to figure out what this is. Sometimes those words contain part of the truth, but beneath them is often something more primal. He is realizing that what started as desire has crossed into a region where control becomes harder. Because now he is no longer only responding to beauty or chemistry. He is responding to the possibility that this person can touch his emotional world in ways he did not consent to consciously. That is what makes it so destabilizing. He may have wanted her body. Now he wants her presence. He may have wanted the spark. Now he wants the safety. He may have wanted the tension. Now he wants the truth. He may have wanted the experience. Now he wants to know whether he matters to her too. And that shift can feel deeply humiliating to a masculine ego trained to equate emotional need with weakness. Because many men have inherited a distorted idea of strength. They have learned how to carry lust, ambition, anger, competition, and even pain more easily than tenderness. They have learned how to want without revealing, how to pursue without confessing, how to be affected without naming the depth of their effect. So when desire turns into vulnerability, it feels like the rules have changed. The old masculine says, stay in control. But the body says, you already care. The ego says, keep it light. But the heart says, it is not light anymore. The mind says, do not give this too much meaning. But the soul says, then why does it feel like more than attraction? This inner conflict is where the trigger begins doing its real work. Because the problem is not desire itself. The problem is that desire has become a doorway into longing, into tenderness, into hidden need, into the ache to be met, into fear of rejection, into the terror of wanting something that cannot be obtained through charm alone. That last part matters. Charm can create attraction. Charm cannot satisfy vulnerability. Performance can generate desire. Performance cannot calm the trembling that comes when a man realizes he actually wants to be emotionally received. And once he wants that, something in him changes. He may become more attentive, more inward, more sensitive to small shifts, more aware of her tone, her energy, her distance, her openness. Things that once seemed minor now feel loaded. Why? Because desire has moved from appetite into attachment. Not necessarily full attachment in the clinical sense, but emotional attachment in the human sense. The kind that makes him care how he lands in her world. The kind that makes him want to be understood, not just enjoyed. The kind that makes him feel the possibility of losing something before he has even fully admitted what it is. This can make a man feel incredibly exposed. Because desire that remains physical can still be hidden behind masculinity as performance. But vulnerability asks him to confront a truth many men spend years avoiding. He is not just strong. He is soft in places. Not weak. Soft. Soft enough to ache. Soft enough to miss. Soft enough to feel destabilized by the possibility of not being chosen, not being understood, not being able to sustain access to something that has become emotionally meaningful. This softness is not the enemy. But to an unawakened masculine identity, it can feel like one. Why? Because softness threatens the old architecture. The old belief that to be masculine is to remain difficult to affect. That to be powerful is to stay above emotional need. That to be safe is to never let desire turn into anything that could humble him. But desire has a secret. If it goes deep enough, it always humbles. Not because desire is impure, but because deep desire eventually reveals what a man worships, what he fears, what he lacks, and what he has not yet learned to hold with discipline and truth. A man may think he is pursuing a woman. Then suddenly he realizes he is confronting himself. Confronting how quickly desire becomes anxiety when emotional reciprocity matters. Confronting how much he uses seduction as a substitute for sincerity. Confronting how attraction can awaken an old wound of inadequacy. Confronting how much of his masculine identity depends on staying one step removed from full emotional exposure. This is where the divine masculine begins to be altered. Because once desire has turned into vulnerability, he can no longer pretend that his issue is just attraction. His issue is whether he can survive being touched in places he cannot dominate. Can he survive wanting more than he can casually admit? Can he survive caring enough to feel uncertainty? Can he survive the loss of emotional advantage? Can he survive the revelation that beneath his desire was a longing to be known? These questions are not rhetorical in the soul. They are initiatory. Because initiation always asks a man to meet a part of himself he has kept outside the room. And vulnerability is often that hidden part. Not dramatic vulnerability. Not performative openness. A quieter one. The vulnerability of realizing, I am not as detached as I said. I am not only drawn to her. I am affected by her. I do not only want the experience. I want what the experience is awakening in me. I do not only desire contact. I desire significance. That realization can scare a man more than rejection itself. Because rejection hurts once. Vulnerability threatens the entire system that kept him from such hurt in the first place. So what does he do? Sometimes he retreats into desire again. He flattens the connection. Makes it physical in his mind. Calls it chemistry. Calls it temptation. Calls it something hot and temporary. Anything but the deeper truth. Why? Because if he names the vulnerability, he must also admit that what is happening matters. And if it matters, then he has to face the possibility of loss, responsibility, truthfulness, and transformation. This is why many men oscillate at this stage. Warm, then distant. Drawn in, then guarded. Honest in flashes, then hard to reach again. They are not merely playing games, though sometimes the behavior wounds like a game. Often they are wrestling with the fact that desire has opened a chamber in them they do not yet know how to inhabit with maturity. That chamber contains tenderness, need, longing, fear, the wish to trust, the fear of trust, the desire to surrender, the fear that surrender will cost them the identity they have spent years protecting. And yet, this is precisely why the trigger is sacred. Because desire that turns into vulnerability is one of the few experiences strong enough to reveal to a man that his heart is not a machine. It is not only a source of appetite. It is also a place of buried devotion. He may not know that at first. He may only know that he feels more than he wanted to. That he is shaken by small things. That his body and mind are carrying a person differently than before. But beneath that confusion, something holy is beginning. He is being introduced to the difference between consuming and cherishing. Desire consumes. Vulnerability can begin to cherish. Desire wants access. Vulnerability wants meaning. Desire seeks the moment. Vulnerability asks what the moment is awakening. This is where masculine energy starts to refine. Because once a man notices that what he feels is no longer simple hunger, he must decide what kind of man he will become in relation to that feeling. Will he use desire to escape vulnerability? Will he reduce what is sacred to something easier to control? Will he retreat because caring feels too risky? Or will he let this unexpected tenderness teach him something about his own soul? That is the deeper choice. Because the divine masculine is not awakened by desire alone. He is awakened when desire reveals the hidden emotional and spiritual architecture beneath it. The need to be chosen. The fear of not being enough. The longing to rest. The ache to be seen without performance. The hunger for a love that does not merely stimulate him, but reorder him. These truths do not emerge in casual attraction. They emerge when desire lingers long enough to become vulnerable. And vulnerability, despite what the old masculine fears, is not a collapse of power. It is the purification of power. It forces him to stop relating to intimacy through appetite alone. It forces him to stop mistaking conquest for connection. It forces him to confront whether he knows how to honor what he feels, not just chase it. A man who can only desire is still immature in love. A man who can become vulnerable without losing his center is beginning to awaken. That distinction matters. Because sacred intimacy does not ask a man to feel less. It asks him to tell the truth about what he feels. To stop calling every deep ache chemistry. To stop hiding emotional hunger behind sexual language. To stop pretending that longing is simple when it is clearly reshaping his inner world. This is why the trigger is so shocking. He thought it was desire. Then he discovered it was exposure. He thought he wanted the experience. Then he discovered he wanted to be met. He thought he could stay above it. Then he discovered that some connections do not merely stir the body. They uncover the soul. And once the soul is uncovered, the old masculinity starts losing its authority. The version of him that relied on distance no longer feels as convincing. The version of him that hid behind appetite starts feeling thin. The version of him that believed vulnerability made him lesser begins to tremble before a new possibility. What if vulnerability is not the thing that weakens him? What if it is the thing that humanizes him enough to awaken him? That question can change everything. Because once he stops running from the vulnerability hidden inside desire, he becomes capable of a different kind of masculinity. Not the masculinity of conquest. The masculinity of reverence. He becomes more careful with what he awakens in others. More honest about what is happening in himself. More willing to admit that he is not just moved physically, but emotionally and spiritually. More capable of seeing intimacy as something that asks for responsibility, not just expression. That is a major transformation. And it begins here. At the moment desire becomes too deep to remain merely desire. At the moment he realizes that what he feels is no longer just heat. It is tenderness with risk. Longing with consequence. Attraction with revelation. That is trigger 4. The moment desire turns into vulnerability, and the man who thought he was only chasing a feeling realizes that the feeling has begun to change him from within. Chapter 7. Trigger 5. Losing the connection that exposed his soul. There are some losses that do not feel like ordinary endings. They feel like an echo. Not because the relationship lasted the longest. Not because the story was the most stable. Not because everything was fully spoken, fully understood, or fully completed. But because something in that connection reached a place inside him that had never been touched in quite the same way before. And when it is gone, the absence does not behave like simple absence. It becomes revelation. This is one of the deepest and most shocking intimacy triggers in the transformation of the divine masculine. Not merely loving someone, not merely being desired by someone, but losing a connection that exposed his soul before he had the maturity, clarity, or courage to fully honor what it was asking of him. That kind of loss changes a man differently. Because what he loses is not only the person. He loses the mirror. He loses the presence that reflected his depth back to him. The presence that stirred his hidden tenderness. The presence that exposed the limits of his control, the cost of his distance, the ache beneath his strength. The parts of himself he could ignore before but could no longer ignore once intimacy made them visible. This is why some men do not awaken while the connection is alive. They awaken after it is gone. Not because absence is more powerful than love, but because loss removes the possibility of delay. While the connection is still there, even in a fragile form, a man can tell himself many stories. There is still time. She is still here. The door is not fully closed. I can figure this out later. I do not have to face the full truth yet. As long as some version of the bond remains, he may continue postponing the confrontation that intimacy has already begun. But once it is gone, truly gone, something collapses. The luxury of postponement. The illusion of endless access. The comforting belief that sacred things can wait forever while he remains emotionally divided. And in that collapse, reality begins to speak with a brutal kind of clarity. Not always in words. Often in ache. The ache of what he did not say. The ache of what he felt but minimized. The ache of what he knew was meaningful but handled casually. The ache of realizing that a connection can be spiritually significant even if the ego was not yet mature enough to steward it well. This is what makes the loss so transformative. He is not only grieving her. He is grieving the truth she revealed in him. The truth that he could feel more deeply than he admitted. The truth that he was more vulnerable than his image allowed. The truth that his usual strategies did not protect him from impact. The truth that what he once called freedom was sometimes only a way of avoiding the responsibility of sacred closeness. When the connection ends, these truths do not disappear with it. They often become louder. He may try to distract himself. Many do. New attention. New stimulation. New projects. New routines. New stories to tell about why it ended, why it was necessary, why it was not meant to be, why moving on quickly proves strength. But if the bond truly exposed his soul, distraction does not cure the deeper effect. Because the loss has already become initiatory. He remembers too much. Not only moments. Meanings. The way she saw through him. The way he felt different around her. The way desire became tenderness. The way her presence unsettled his defenses. The way her absence now exposes how much he relied on delay, ambiguity, or emotional distance to avoid becoming the man the connection was asking for. This is why the memory lingers. Not because he is weak. Not because he is doomed. But because the soul remembers what the ego tried to reduce. The ego may say, it was just timing. The soul says, it was a mirror. The ego may say, there will be others. The soul says, that is not the point. The ego may say, you can replace the feeling. The soul says, can you replace the truth? That is the real confrontation inside this trigger. Because losing the connection that exposed his soul is not merely about heartbreak. It is about exposure without anesthesia. Now there is no more active closeness to hide inside. No more emotional movement from her softening the edges of his unfinishedness. No more immediate access distracting him from the seriousness of what was placed in his hands. Now there is only him. And what the loss reveals about him. That revelation can be devastating. He may begin to see how much he knew, even while pretending not to know. How many moments he felt the sacredness and still hesitated. How often he chose self-protection over truth. How often he asked for understanding while resisting the kind of honesty that would have made understanding fruitful. How often he imagined he had more time than he actually did. These realizations hurt precisely because they are clarifying. And clarity, when it arrives too late to preserve what it illuminates, feels like grief. But grief is not the enemy here. Grief is the teacher. Because grief strips away the lies a man might still tell himself if the connection were merely inconvenient instead of significant. If it were shallow, grief would pass quickly. If it were only about attraction, distraction would work. If it were only about ego, replacement would soothe. But when the grief remains, when the loss keeps echoing, when the memory carries spiritual weight, it often means something deeper was touched. Something in him woke up. And now it must either grow, or be buried again under more performance. This is the crossroads loss creates. A man can respond to this trigger in two very different ways. He can harden. He can make a religion out of detachment. Tell himself that caring deeply is dangerous. Conclude that vulnerability is costly and therefore not worth it. Become colder. Sharper. More defended. More committed to never being so exposed again. Many men choose this. And from the outside, it may even look like strength. But it is not awakening. It is fear with armor. The other path is more difficult. He can let the loss educate him. He can let it show him what kind of man he was when sacred intimacy arrived. He can let it reveal what parts of him were still too fragmented, too cautious, too proud, too emotionally unformed. Too dependent on control to meet the connection with the reverence it deserved. He can let it break his illusion that deep things can always be revisited later. He can let it teach him the cost of delay. This second path is where the divine masculine begins to rise in a new way. Because now awakening is no longer theoretical. It is personal. Now he does not only understand intimacy as a beautiful idea. He understands it as consequence. He understands that a soul-deep connection is not something to casually stand near while remaining half awake. He understands that some people enter his life not merely to love him, but to expose the precise places where he still avoids love's demands. He understands that the pain of losing what exposed him is not just punishment. It is revelation. And revelation, though severe, is mercy. Because it tells the truth about what he values, what he fears, what he postpones. what he was not yet able to hold. What kind of man he must become if something sacred ever comes into his life again. This is why loss can refine him. Not automatically. Only if he surrenders to its deeper instruction. He must stop asking only, "How do I get over this?" and begin asking, "What is this loss trying to teach me about who I was?" That question is transformative, because it shifts the focus from possession to purpose, from nostalgia to formation, from romanticizing the connection to examining the self that stood inside it. A man may discover that he did not lack feeling. He lacked steadiness. He may discover that he did not lack recognition. He lacked the courage to act in alignment with what he recognized. He may discover that he did not fail because the connection was false. He failed because parts of him were still more loyal to self-protection than to truth. These realizations do not destroy masculinity. They mature it. Because mature masculinity is not proven by how little a man feels after loss. It is proven by what loss teaches him to become. Does he become bitter? Or wiser? Does he become numb? Or cleaner? Does he build more walls? Or more integrity? Does he use grief to justify emotional distance forever? Or does he let grief humble him into a deeper reverence for intimacy, timing, honesty, and the sacred responsibility of being fully present when something real is in front of him? This is the deeper initiation hidden inside loss. The connection may be gone, but the mirror remains. And now, without the urgency of trying to preserve the bond, he is left with a purer confrontation. Not, "How do I fix this?" but, "Who was I in the presence of something holy?" That question can undo a man. Because sometimes the most painful part is not that he lost her. It is that he met a version of himself through her, a version more vulnerable, more alive, more emotionally real. And he realizes he was not yet brave enough to fully inhabit that version while the door was open. This is where regret enters. And regret can poison a man if he uses it only to worship the past. But regret can also purify a man if he lets it strip away illusion. Healthy regret says, "I see now what I could not fully admit then. I see the cost of my hesitation. I see how fear disguised itself as wisdom. I see how emotional distance kept me from becoming. I see how I mishandled what revealed my own soul to me." That kind of regret is not self-hatred. It is moral awakening. It creates the conditions for repentance in the deepest sense. Not performative guilt. Realignment. A turning of the inner life toward truth. A refusal to keep defending the patterns that cost him what he now knows mattered. A willingness to say, without embellishment, "Yes, I was unfinished there. Yes, I let fear govern me. Yes, I delayed what should have been honored sooner." This honesty is sacred. Because once a man can speak that way, something in him is becoming trustworthy. And trustworthiness is one of the great fruits of this trigger. The man who has truly been changed by losing the connection that exposed his soul becomes less casual with intimacy, less arrogant with timing, less likely to assume that what is rare will always remain available, less willing to hide behind ambiguity while receiving the emotional gifts of another person's openness. He becomes more reverent. Reverence is the mature form of what loss was trying to teach. It is the understanding that intimacy is not a toy for the ego, not a stage for performance, not a supply of emotional stimulation, not a place to collect profound feelings while postponing responsibility. It is sacred ground. And sacred ground must be walked with honesty, self-awareness, and presence. This is what the connection taught him, even if he learned it too late to preserve that specific form. That is another hard truth. Sometimes the lesson ripens after the loss, not before it. But even then, the loss is not wasted if it changes the man. If it makes him more truthful, more grounded, more disciplined, more capable of recognizing when something is touching his soul and responding with clarity instead of delay. More willing to meet future intimacy with the seriousness it deserves. Then the connection, though lost in form, has still done holy work. This is why some losses become blessings in disguise, not because pain itself is beautiful, but because pain stripped away what comfort allowed to remain hidden. It showed him the cost of being half awake. It showed him the limits of charm, avoidance, and emotional control. It showed him that some mirrors do not enter a man's life to flatter him, but to initiate him. It showed him that he cannot keep calling deep things complicated, when what they really ask for is courage. And perhaps most importantly, it showed him that the soul does not forget what truly revealed it. The memory remains, not necessarily to torment him, but to guard him against returning to the old illusion that intimacy can be delayed forever without consequence. That illusion is gone now, and in its place stands a new possibility. A man who no longer wants to merely feel deeply. A man who wants to honor depth properly. A man who no longer wants to be haunted by what he failed to hold. A man who wants to become capable of holding what is sacred when it arrives. A man who no longer uses loss only to mourn the person. A man who lets loss transform the self. That is why this trigger changes the divine masculine so profoundly. Because losing the connection that exposed his soul forces him to confront the distance between being affected and being ready. Between recognizing what is rare and reverencing it in time. Between longing for sacred love and living like a man prepared to meet it with clean hands. That confrontation is painful. But it is also one of the most honest things that can happen to him. And if he does not waste it, if he lets it cut through pride, illusion, and delay, then the connection has not merely ended. It has initiated him. Into grief. Into humility. Into responsibility. Into a new masculinity that no longer wants to stand near the sacred while remaining half-hidden. It wants to become a man who can meet the sacred fully. That is the gift hidden inside the loss. Not comfort. Not easy closure. Transformation. Because sometimes the connection that exposed his soul is the one he loses. And sometimes that loss is exactly what teaches him, at last, how deeply a man must change if he ever wants to stop losing what came to wake him up. Chapter 8. Why these triggers feel so shocking. By now, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. These triggers are not shocking simply because they are emotional. They are shocking because they strike at the exact places where the sleeping masculine has built his identity. They do not merely stir feelings. They destabilize structure. That is why they hit with such force. To someone watching from the outside, the reactions may seem exaggerated. Why would being seen unsettle him so much? Why would emotional intimacy make him retreat? Why would a woman's stillness shake him more than her pursuit? Why would desire becoming vulnerability feel almost unbearable? Why would the loss of one connection echo louder than so many others? Because the trigger is never only about the event itself. It is about what the event touches. And what these intimacy triggers touch is not casual. They reach into the hidden architecture of masculine self-protection. They expose the places where a man has mistaken survival for identity, distance for power, control for safety, and unreadability for strength. That is why the experience feels so shocking. It is not simply that he feels deeply. It is that he feels his own inner construction being challenged. There is a major difference between being emotionally moved and being existentially exposed. A song can move him. A memory can move him. A beautiful conversation can move him. But these triggers do something else. They expose the gap between who he thinks he is and who he actually becomes when intimacy reaches beyond his defenses. That gap is the real shock. A man may think he is calm until intimacy reveals that his calm depends on distance. He may think he is strong until intimacy reveals that his strength depends on not being touched too deeply. He may think he is free until intimacy reveals how much he panics when he cannot control emotional access. He may think he is self-contained until loss reveals how much of his inner life had been quietly attached. This kind of exposure does not merely affect mood. It affects self-concept. And when self-concept is threatened, the nervous system reacts. That is another reason these triggers feel so intense. They are not only psychological. They are bodily. The body remembers what the mind tries to manage. The body registers closeness, danger, tenderness, uncertainty. and emotional risk long before the intellect creates a neat explanation. So a man may say, "I don't know why this affects me so much." But his body knows. It knows when someone has gotten too close to the wound. It knows when the old armor is no longer working. It knows when the pattern of control is being interrupted. It knows when tenderness is awakening needs he was trained to suppress. It knows when the possibility of being known feels both relieving and dangerous. This is why triggers can create such contradictory responses. He feels drawn in and wants to run. He feels softened and becomes guarded. He feels longing and suddenly reaches for distance. He feels the truth of the connection and then starts reducing it with logic. He feels the sacredness of what is happening and then panics because sacred things demand change. These contradictions are not random. They are signs of inner conflict between two masculinities: the old masculine and the awakening masculine. The old masculine wants control, image, emotional advantage, and safety through distance. The awakening masculine wants truth, connection, integration, reverence, and the courage to be changed. When a trigger hits, these two selves collide. That collision is the shock. Because now he is no longer living smoothly inside one familiar identity. He is being divided open. One part of him wants to preserve the old structure. Another part can feel that the old structure is precisely what is suffocating him. This is why triggers often feel bigger than the moment should justify. The moment is carrying more than itself. It is carrying history. The history of what he learned about masculinity. The history of how he survived pain. The history of what vulnerability cost him in the past. The history of how often he had to perform instead of reveal. The history of how he built a life around appearing unaffected. When intimacy touches all of that at once, of course it feels overwhelming. It is not just a present moment feeling. It is the activation of an entire survival system. That is why one woman's gaze can shake him. Why one honest conversation can stay with him for days. Why one withdrawal can trigger grief larger than the situation appears to deserve. Why one loss can unravel a story he has been telling himself for years. The trigger is opening old rooms. Rooms marked fear, shame, longing, abandonment, need, tenderness, powerlessness, the ache of not feeling fully safe to be real. Many men do not have language for these rooms. They only know the symptoms: withdrawal, silence, distance, restlessness, obsessive thinking, mood shifts, confusion, the urge to control the pace, the urge to flatten the connection, the urge to regain the upper hand. These are not the cause. They are the response. The real cause is deeper. The trigger has brushed against the place where masculine shadow still lives. And what is the masculine shadow in this context? It is not evil in the dramatic sense. It is the unintegrated part of masculinity. The part that learned to harden instead of feel. The part that uses control to hide fear. The part that wants intimacy but resists accountability. The part that confuses silence with wisdom. The part that wants to be chosen but fears being truly known. The part that seeks depth but still worships self-protection. These triggers feel shocking because they illuminate the shadow all at once. They make visible what a man might otherwise keep split off for years. He suddenly sees how much he needs control. How fragile his calm becomes when intimacy deepens. How quickly he interprets emotional truth as danger. How much of his desire is tied to hidden longing. How much of his distance has been self-protection disguised as maturity. This can be deeply humbling. And humility is jarring to the ego. The ego likes stable narratives. I am strong. I am detached. I am clear. I am not like other men. I know what I'm doing. I'm just careful. I'm just not emotional. A trigger comes in and says, "Then why did this shake you? Why did that silence haunt you? Why did that woman's stillness expose you? Why did being seen make you restless? Why did losing access feel like losing ground inside yourself?" The ego does not enjoy these questions. but the soul often depends on them. Because without them, a man can keep living in spiritual sleep. And spiritual sleep is not always obvious. It can exist inside successful lives, disciplined routines, confident speech, admirable goals, even strong values. A man can look highly functional and still be inwardly fragmented. The trigger reveals the fragmentation. That is why it feels like a shock to the system. Because it is. It is an interruption of false continuity. An interruption of the story that says, I am fine as I am. An interruption of the illusion that deep intimacy can be tasted without transformation. An interruption of the belief that he can keep receiving emotional revelation while staying internally unchanged. He cannot. At some point, what intimacy reveals must be answered. And that is another reason the triggers feel so strong. They carry demand. Not demand from the woman alone. Not demand from the relationship alone. Demand from truth. Truth says, you cannot keep calling this peace if it is built on avoidance. You cannot keep calling this strength if it collapses under emotional closeness. You cannot keep calling this freedom if you are secretly ruled by the need to stay in control. You cannot keep wanting sacred connection while defending the very patterns that sabotage it. This is why these triggers do not feel like minor emotional events. They feel like summons. A summons into greater honesty. A summons into deeper responsibility. A summons into a masculinity that is no longer built on the worship of self-protection. And yet, because the old masculine fears this summons, the first experience is often shock. Shock that he cares. Shock that he is affected. Shock that he cannot easily move on. Shock that the person who saw him changed him more than the ones who admired him. Shock that what he thought was simple desire became spiritual confrontation. Shock that the connection he lost now feels like a lesson his soul cannot ignore. These shocks are sacred because they break numbness. They force him to stop pretending he is untouched. They force him to stop performing indifference. They force him to ask deeper questions than, do I like her? Or is this convenient? Or what do I get from this? Now the questions become, why does this shake me so much? What part of me is being exposed? Why does closeness feel like both home and danger? What am I still protecting that intimacy keeps threatening? What old version of me is trying to survive this revelation? These are awakening questions. Because the real purpose of the trigger is not emotional chaos. It is consciousness. It is to make him aware of what has been operating underneath his identity all along. Awareness can feel brutal. But without it, nothing deeper can change. The sleeping masculine does not need more comfort first. He needs recognition. Recognition of his patterns. Recognition of his fear. Recognition of where he is still ruled by defense. Recognition of where he has mistaken emotional illiteracy for masculine steadiness. Once he sees, truly sees, then the trigger has done its first sacred work. It has awakened self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is the beginning of freedom. Not because seeing immediately heals him, but because what is seen can no longer so easily hide. This is why the shock matters. Shock is often the crack where light enters. The disruption that breaks autopilot. The moment the old identity realizes it can no longer move unquestioned through life. The place where the man who has relied on performance begins to realize he must either deepen or repeat. He must either deepen into truth or repeat the same pattern in new forms. A new woman, same defense. A new connection, same distance. A new promise, same emotional vagueness. A new heartbreak, same old rationalizations. The trigger is trying to stop the repetition. It is saying, look here. Not at her only. Not at the connection only. At yourself. Look at what gets activated. Look at what you fear. Look at what you avoid. Look at what you call strength. Look at what your nervous system is trying to protect. Look at what your soul is quietly asking to outgrow. That is why these triggers feel so shocking. Because they are not only about intimacy. They are about identity. They are about shadow. They are about the collapse of self-deception. They are about the painful but holy transition from emotional survival into emotional truth. And for the divine masculine, this is essential. Because he cannot awaken by staying comfortable inside a fractured self. He must be disrupted. He must be revealed. He must be shown where he is still split between desire and fear, love and control, depth and avoidance, truth and performance. The shock is not the end. It is the opening. It is the tremor before the deeper reconstruction. It is the breaking of the shell. It is the first undeniable sign that intimacy has stopped being a feeling he can manage and become a force that is calling him into a different kind of manhood. A manhood with less theater, less hiding, less image, less emotional exile, and more truth, more responsibility, more reverence, more courage to be changed by what he says he wants. So yes, these triggers are shocking. Not because they are wrong. Not because intimacy has failed. Not because he is weak for being shaken. They are shocking because they touch the exact places where false masculinity has been living. And when false masculinity is touched deeply enough, it trembles. That trembling is painful. But it is also promising. Because the man who trembles before truth is often much closer to awakening than the man who still feels nothing and mistakes that numbness for power. That is the deeper meaning of the shock. It is not proof that something has gone wrong. It is proof that something real has finally reached him. Chapter 9. What the divine masculine becomes after the shock. After the shock, after the trigger, after the moment that breaks his old emotional rhythm, something very important begins to happen. Not always immediately. Not cleanly. Not without resistance. But it begins. The man who was once protected by performance starts to realize that performance no longer works the way it used to. The man who once trusted distance starts to feel the emptiness inside that distance. The man who once believed control made him strong starts to notice how fragile that strength becomes the moment intimacy touches something real. And this is the threshold where the divine masculine starts to change. Not because the triggers themselves are magical. Not because pain automatically makes a man deeper. Not because longing alone transforms anyone. He changes because the shock breaks his agreement with illusion. That is the true turning point. Before the shock, a man may still be living with a certain unconscious loyalty to the version of himself that helped him survive. The composed version, the self-contained version, the emotionally cautious version, the version that knows how to want without revealing, how to connect without surrendering, how to remain admired without being fully known. But after the shock, especially if it is deep enough, something in him becomes unable to rest inside that old identity. He may still try. He may still run back to the old habits. He may still call the experience too much, too complicated, or not the right time. But beneath those explanations, another process is underway. He has seen himself. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to know he is more vulnerable than he admitted. Enough to know he is more emotionally affected than he pretended. Enough to know his patterns are not just personality traits, but defenses. Enough to know that some part of his masculinity has been built around avoiding the very depth he claims to desire. That kind of self-seeing changes a man slowly, but profoundly. Because now he is no longer only reacting to another person. He is reacting to the truth that another person revealed in him. That distinction matters. The immature masculine often focuses on the outer story. She affected me. She confused me. She triggered me. She left. She changed the dynamic. She stopped chasing. She became distant. The awakening masculine begins asking a different question. What did all of this show me about myself? That question is sacred. Because once he asks it honestly, the direction of his life starts to shift. He stops treating the connection only as an event and begins recognizing it as initiation. He stops asking merely how to relieve the discomfort and starts asking what the discomfort came to teach. This is where his inner posture begins to change. He becomes less reactive and more reflective. Less interested in blame and more interested in truth. Less attached to protecting image and more willing to examine the structure underneath it. This does not mean he becomes soft in the shallow sense. It means he becomes deeper. And depth changes everything. A shallow masculine wants quick restoration of control. A deepening masculine wants understanding. A shallow masculine asks, how do I get back to feeling powerful? A deepening masculine asks, what kind of power was I living from if truth could shake it this badly? A shallow masculine wants the discomfort to end. A deepening masculine begins to suspect that the discomfort may be the very place where a truer self is being formed. This is how the divine masculine begins to rise after the shock. First, he becomes harder to deceive, especially by himself. He starts noticing the old language. I'm just private. I need space. I don't want drama. I'm focused on my life. These things just happen. Again, some of these statements may hold partial truth, but now he hears them differently. He starts noticing when they are being used to protect a wound rather than express wisdom. He starts noticing when space is actually fear, when clarity is a delay tactic, when strength is really emotional avoidance, when peace is really disconnection. This new awareness is not comfortable, but it is clean. And cleanliness matters in awakening. Because the divine masculine is not merely a man who feels intensely. He is a man who becomes inwardly ordered. A man who begins to reduce self-deception. A man who stops dressing up unfinished patterns as noble traits. A man who grows less willing to let ego speak in the language of maturity. That is a major transformation. After the shock, if he is truly changing, he also becomes more reverent. Before awakening, he may have approached intimacy as an experience. Something magnetic. Something exciting. Something stimulating. Something beautiful, yes, but still partly consumable. After the shock, he begins to understand intimacy as responsibility. He starts realizing that emotional closeness is not casual. That being seen is not casual. That desire is not casual when it opens the heart. That a woman's presence, trust, softness, or emotional depth is not something to enjoy while remaining spiritually half asleep. This realization matures him. He becomes more careful with what he awakens, more honest with what he feels, more conscious of the cost of ambiguity, more aware that his inconsistency is not mysterious, it is consequential, more aware that deep connection cannot be entered with one foot unless he is willing to create pain for both himself and the other person. This is where the awakened masculine begins separating himself from the immature one. The immature masculine says, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. The awakening masculine says, intent does not erase the effect of my lack of clarity. The immature masculine says, I was just confused. The awakening masculine says, then I must learn why confusion has so often become my hiding place. The immature masculine says, I needed time. The awakening masculine says, why did I assume sacred things would wait for me while I stayed divided? These are powerful shifts. Because now he is no longer living only from emotional instinct. He is beginning to develop moral weight. And moral weight is part of what makes the divine masculine feel different. It is not only emotional depth. It is the willingness to be shaped by truth, to take responsibility for energy, words, timing, presence, absence, desire, and the consequences of delay. After the shock, the man who is really changing also becomes more humble. This is essential. Without humility, the trigger only turns into a dramatic memory. With humility, it becomes formation. Humility lets him admit, I was more afraid than I realized. I was more moved than I admitted. I was still living from old defenses. I called some things complicated because I was not yet willing to become simple and truthful. I wanted depth, but I was still protecting myself from the cost of depth. These admissions do not make him smaller. They make him real. And reality is where sacred masculinity begins. Not fantasy. Not branding. Not archetypal performance. Reality. The reality of a man who now understands that he cannot keep asking life for sacred intimacy while refusing sacred accountability. The reality of a man who knows that the shock came not to destroy him, but to confront the gap between what he says he values and what he is actually prepared to embody. As this awareness grows, his relationship to love changes. He stops seeing love only as a place of emotional reward. He begins seeing love as a place of refinement. Not punishment. Refinement. He realizes that love is not merely asking him, "What do you feel?" It is asking, "Who are you when you feel deeply?" That question becomes one of the great tests of his becoming. Who is he when he is seen? Who is he when he is wanted? Who is he when he is vulnerable? Who is he when he is no longer being chased? Who is he when he loses something that mattered? Who is he after the shock? The answer to that question determines whether the trigger becomes just another painful chapter or a true turning point in masculine evolution. And if it becomes a turning point, certain things begin to emerge in him. He becomes more disciplined, not in a rigid way, in a sacred way. He learns that not every emotion should be acted on impulsively, that not every fear should be obeyed, that not every urge to withdraw is wisdom, that not every wave of intensity is destiny, that not every moment of discomfort means something is wrong. This discipline is beautiful because it is no longer about image. It is about integrity. Before, he may have been disciplined in work, goals, routines, success. Now he is being asked to become disciplined in truth, disciplined in tenderness, disciplined in clarity, disciplined in how he handles another person's heart and his own. That is a different level of manhood. After the shock, he also becomes less obsessed with possession and more devoted to purpose. This is one of the deepest changes. Before, a man may have been focused on keeping the connection, preserving emotional advantage, maintaining access, or protecting himself from loss. Even his longing could still be tangled with ego. But after true awakening begins, he starts asking a different question. What is all of this asking me to become? That is the question of purpose. Not, how do I get her back? Not, how do I stop feeling this? Not, how do I regain control? But, what kind of man must I become if I never want to stand before something sacred this unfinished again? That question changes the trajectory of his life. Because now the connection becomes more than romance. It becomes instruction, mirror, fire, consecration, and the man who accepts that no longer wants only relief. He wants transformation. That is when the divine masculine becomes truly dangerous to illusion. He no longer wants to be admired as deep. He wants to become deep. He no longer wants to sound wise. He wants to be clean. He no longer wants to keep the old mask and simply have better language for it. He wants to stop needing the mask. This is the man who starts to emerge after the shock. A man who speaks more carefully, who promises less recklessly, who listens more honestly, who notices when fear is dressing itself as discernment, who notices when old defenses are trying to reclaim control, who begins choosing truth over emotional convenience. And perhaps most importantly, he becomes a man who can no longer fully romanticize his own avoidance. That matters because avoidance often survives through seduction. It seduces a man into believing his distance is noble, his vagueness is complex, his silence is wisdom, his delay is prudence. But once the shock has truly done its work, that seduction weakens. He begins to see avoidance as costly, as spiritually expensive, as something that may protect his ego in the moment while impoverishing his soul over time. This realization is one of the clearest signs that he is changing. Because the awakened masculine no longer wants protection at any cost. He wants truth, even when truth is costly. He wants alignment, even when alignment strips away old comforts. He wants sacred love, but he now understands that sacred love requires sacred manhood. And sacred manhood is not built through fantasy. It is built through surrender, discipline, grief, humility, and the long decision to become congruent. That is what the divine masculine becomes after the shock. Not instantly healed. Not suddenly perfect. Not free from all contradiction overnight. But initiated. Initiated into a life where he can no longer comfortably live beneath his own knowing. Initiated into a masculinity that must become more honest, more grounded, more reverent, more capable of carrying intimacy without turning it into a war between ego and soul. The shock does not finish him. It begins him. It strips away some illusions. It reveals his unfinishedness. It confronts him with the cost of delay, avoidance, and emotional self-protection. But if he receives it rightly, it also gives him something priceless. A chance to become. A chance to become the man who does not need to hide behind control. The man who can stay present when intimacy reaches deep. The man who does not only feel sacred things, but learns to honor them. The man who becomes strong enough to hold tenderness without shame. The man who chooses responsibility over reaction, truth over strategy, purpose over possession. That is what the divine masculine becomes after the shock. Not a man without wounds. A man no longer ruled by them. Not a man without fear. A man who stops letting fear define his form of love. Not a man untouched by intimacy. A man finally willing to let intimacy make him honest enough to change. And once that process has truly begun, he is never quite the same again. Chapter 10. The trigger was never the end, it was the beginning. At first, he thinks the trigger is the story. The moment he was seen. The intimacy he could not control. The woman who stopped chasing. The desire that became vulnerability. The connection he lost before he was ready to honor it. He thinks that was the event that changed everything. And in one sense, it was. But only partially. Because the deeper truth is this. The trigger was never the destination. It was the doorway. It was never the end of the story. It was the beginning of the man he had not yet become. This is what the divine masculine slowly learns after the shock has done its work. The trigger did not come merely to wound him, confuse him, humble him, or leave him haunted by what he could not control. It came to interrupt the old version of him strongly enough that he could no longer keep living in the same emotional pattern with the same innocence. Before the trigger, he could still sleep inside illusion. After the trigger, illusion becomes harder to inhabit. That is the real beginning. Not perfection. Not immediate reunion. Not some dramatic overnight transformation where every fear dissolves and every answer becomes clear. A beginning of consciousness. A beginning of honesty. A beginning of responsibility. A beginning of inner reordering. He starts to understand that intimacy was never just about another person entering his life. It was also about truth entering his life. It was about the collapse of emotional shortcuts. The collapse of the belief that he could want sacred things while remaining half-hidden. The collapse of the belief that depth could be admired without being embodied. The collapse of the belief that masculinity could remain emotionally defended and still become whole. This is why the trigger changes its meaning over time. At first, it feels like chaos. Later, it begins to feel like revelation. At first, it feels like loss of control. Later, it begins to feel like the exposure of false control. At first, it feels like pain. Later, it becomes instruction. At first, he asks, "Why did this happen to me?" Later, he begins to ask, "What was this trying to awaken in me?" That second question is where the beginning truly starts. Because once a man stops worshiping the emotional event itself and starts listening for its deeper message, he begins to mature. He begins to understand that the purpose of the trigger was not simply to make him suffer. It was to initiate him into a more truthful form of manhood. A manhood that does not depend on image. A manhood that does not need to dominate intimacy in order to feel safe. A manhood that does not hide behind silence and call it peace. A manhood that can hold tenderness without shame, desire without recklessness, and vulnerability without collapsing into self-protection. This is what the beginning looks like. It looks like him becoming quieter inside, but more honest. It looks like less performance and more self-observation. It looks like noticing how quickly he once used distance, control, or ambiguity and no longer feeling proud of those patterns. It looks like becoming less impressed by chemistry alone and more interested in inner congruence. It looks like no longer asking only whether a connection feels intense, but whether he is becoming a man capable of honoring intensity with discipline and truth. That is the shift. And the shift matters because it changes the way he lives even beyond love. He becomes different in his speech. More careful. Less inflated. Less eager to say things that sound deep while still living shallowly. More willing to let his words be measured by his actions. He becomes different in his relationships. Less drawn to dynamics that let him stay fragmented. More aware of how his energy affects others. More reverent toward emotional openness. More conscious that being deeply felt by someone is not something to handle casually. He becomes different in his inner world. Less fascinated by control. Less dependent on emotional advantage. Less loyal to the old identity that survived by staying hard to read. More willing to be known by truth, even before he is known by another person. This is why the trigger was never the end. Because if the trigger had only hurt him, it would have been a tragedy. But if it begins transforming him, it becomes a consecration. It becomes the fire through which false masculinity starts to burn away. The old masculinity says, protect yourself first. Do not reveal too much. Do not care too much. Do not let intimacy humble you. Do not let anyone see how deeply you feel. Do not lose control. But the awakened masculine begins hearing a different voice. Tell the truth. Feel what is real. Stop calling fear wisdom. Stop calling distance freedom. Stop calling emotional exile strength. Stop protecting the mask more than the soul. This inner change is one of the holiest things that can happen to a man. Because once he begins living from that deeper voice, he becomes dangerous to old cycles. He becomes dangerous to manipulation. Dangerous to performance. Dangerous to self-deception. Dangerous to the version of himself that kept confusing power with avoidance. And that is what true awakening does. It does not merely make a man more emotional. It makes him more aligned. He becomes more internally ordered. He starts valuing what is clean over what is exciting. What is true over what is flattering. What is lasting over what is stimulating. What is sacred over what merely feeds appetite or ego. This does not make him less masculine. It makes him more so. Because the deepest masculine power is not found in control. It is found in stewardship. The stewardship of desire. The stewardship of words. The stewardship of presence. The stewardship of another person's trust. The stewardship of his own soul. And stewardship begins when a man finally realizes that the trigger did not come to destroy his heart. It came to reveal whether his heart was ready to become a place of truth. This is the deeper invitation now standing before him. Will he return to old patterns and call the lesson finished? Or will he let the lesson become architecture? Will he keep collecting powerful experiences without changing? Or will he let one sacred disruption rebuild him from the inside out? Will he keep waiting for a different kind of love? Or will he become a different kind of man? That is the real question at the end of this journey. Because every trigger, no matter how painful, eventually leaves behind a decision. A decision to harden or deepen. To repeat or evolve. To protect illusion or surrender to truth. And the divine masculine is born in that surrender. Not all at once. Not without grief. Not without seasons of confusion, silence, humility, and rebuilding. But truly. Because the man who accepts the deeper meaning of the trigger no longer wants to merely recover. He wants to become. He wants to become a man who does not need to be chased to recognize value. A man who does not need to lose what is sacred in order to understand its weight. A man who does not need to reduce vulnerability to regain power. A man who no longer uses complexity to delay honesty. A man who can meet intimacy with presence instead of panic. A man who can let love refine him instead of merely affect him. That is why the trigger was the beginning. It was the moment life said, wake up. Look deeper. Stop hiding. Stop delaying. Stop building your masculinity around defense. Stop asking for sacred love while resisting sacred growth. And if he listens, truly listens, the rest of his life begins to change. Not because every story ends the way he hoped. Not because every connection returns. not because pain disappears, but because now he is becoming the kind of man who can carry truth without running from it. And that changes everything. Closing message. So let this be the final reminder. The trigger that shook you was not sent to ruin you. It was sent to reveal you. It was not proof that you are weak. It was proof that something real finally reached the places you could no longer keep hidden. It was not the end of your power. It was the end of the false version of power that could only survive through distance, control, and emotional disguise. You were never meant to remain half awake. You were never meant to call self-protection masculinity. You were never meant to stand at the edge of sacred intimacy forever, feeling deeply yet refusing to become deeply honest. You were meant to rise beyond performance, to rise beyond fear disguised as wisdom, to rise beyond the habits that kept your heart guarded and your soul divided, to rise into a masculinity that can hold truth, tenderness, desire, discipline, and purpose in the same body. That is the real journey. That is the real rebirth. That is the real awakening. And the beautiful thing is this: it is not too late. Not too late to tell the truth. Not too late to become more aligned. Not too late to let the shock turn into wisdom. Not too late to let what broke your illusion become the beginning of your transformation. Because the divine masculine is not the man who is never shaken. He is the man who let the shaking make him real. If this message reached something deep in you, comment "I choose truth" below. Tell me which trigger hit the hardest and which chapter felt most personal to your journey. Subscribe for more videos on divine masculine healing, sacred intimacy, emotional awakening, spiritual transformation, and conscious love. And share this video with someone who is standing at the edge of his own awakening.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.